Hello and welcome to Silent Echo. A 19-year-old college student calls his parents in the middle of the night and tells them his car is stuck in a ditch. He is calm. He is not panicking. He says he is not hurt. He can see the lights of a nearby town. His parents get into their truck and start driving toward him while staying on the phone. For nearly an hour they try to find him in the dark fields of rural Minnesota. They ask him to flash his lights. He asks them to flash theirs. They should have seen each other. They never do. Then Brandon Swanson says, 2 words, oh shit. After that there is only silence. The phone line does not explode into chaos. There is no scream, no struggle, no clear sound of water, no sound of another person. Just a sudden break in the conversation, and a silence so complete that it has haunted this case for years. By sunrise his car is found miles from where he believed he was. The area around it is searched over and over again. Roads, ditches, creeks, fields, abandoned farm sites. The yellow Medicine River dogs track his scent. Searchers form lines across the land. Deputies return again and again. Years pass, nothing is found. No body, no clothing, no phone, no confirmed trail that explains where he went after the last words his parents ever heard tonight. We are going to retrace the final known hours of Brandon Swanson in detail, not just the famous last words, not just the call in the dark, but the full sequence of choices, mistakes, distances, and possibilities that turned an ordinary ride home into one of the most unsettling disappearances in modern American true mystery. Because this case is terrifying for one simple reason. For 47 minutes, Brandon was not gone. He was right there, talking, thinking, walking, believing he was headed toward help. And then in one instant, he was simply no longer part of the world anyone else could reach. To understand why this case feels so strange, you have to begin with how ordinary Brandon seemed on the surface. He was 19 years old. He lived in Marshall, Minnesota with his family. He had graduated from high school the year before and was attending Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He was studying wind energy at the Canby campus, which fit the treat landscape around him in a way that almost feels symbolic now. This was open country, long roads, flats, stretches, farm, fields, small towns marked by grain bins, church steeples, and the glow of distant lights at night. People in this part of Minnesota know the roads by memory. They know how far one town sits from the next. They know how dark it gets once you leave the highway and move onto gravel. They know that one wrong turn late at night can place you in a grid of nearly identical roads where every intersection feels familiar and wrong at the same time. Brandon was not a drifter, and he was not living some secret life that anyone around him recognized. He had plans. He had routines. He had family waiting for him at home. Everything about the known facts suggests a young man moving through a normal stage of life and expecting the future to continue as planned. That detail matters because in a lot of famous disappearances, people search for evidence that the missing person intended to leave, a hidden motive, a major conflict, a life they wanted to escape. With Brandon, there was nothing obvious like that. What happened to him began on a night that should have been forgettable. The end of the spring semester, time with friends, a drive home through familiar country. Nothing about the evening announces itself as the opening of a mystery, and that is one reason this story hits so hard. It does not begin with danger. It begins with confidence. The confidence of a young man who believes he knows the landscape well enough to handle a minor problem. The confidence of parents who believe they are about to go pick up their son and bring him home. The confidence of a world that still makes sense for another 47 minutes. Marshall itself sits in southwestern Minnesota, in a region where towns are connected by highways but separated by darkness. Drive a short distance outside town, and the visual world narrows to your headlights and whatever shapes the night decides to reveal: a mailbox, a tree line, a drainage ditch, the glint of water, the suggestion of a building set back from the road. If you are sober, alert, and fully oriented, that landscape is manageable. If you are tired, if you have been out late, if you are slightly turned. Around it can become disorienting with shocking speed. That is the stage on which Brandon disappeared. Not a forest, not a mountain, not a city filled with cameras, just farmland and water and roads that look simple, until the dark removes the details you rely on. On the night Brandon vanished, classes had just ended for the academic year. He stayed in Canby after school, let out and spent the evening with friends. Witnesses later said he drank that night, but not in a way that made him seem heavily intoxicated or unable to function. That point is often repeated because people naturally focus on alcohol in cases like this. A young man, late at night, a crashed car, rural roads, it seems. Like an easy explanation waiting to be accepted, but easy explanations are dangerous in missing person cases because they can blur the line between what is known and what is merely assumed. The known part is this: Brandon spent time at 2 gatherings. He was social. He was not described as out of control. He eventually got into a Chevrolet Lumina and started the drive back toward Marshall. That drive should have taken around half an hour under normal conditions. It was not some major journey across a huge state. It was a short ride through an area he knew, and that matters because the next mystery in the story is not simply that Brandon vanished. It is that he seemed to lose his location without realizing it. Somewhere on the way home, something went wrong. Maybe he missed a turn. Maybe he chose gravel roads as a shortcut. Maybe he thought he was correcting an earlier mistake while actually going farther off course. Anyone who has driven in a rural grid at night knows how little it can take. One turn that looks right, one assumption that the next road will reconnect with the highway, one moment of misplaced certainty, and then the whole map in your head drifts away from the one beneath your tires. At some point shortly before 2 in the morning, Brandon drove his car into a ditch. The vehicle was not smashed to pieces. This was not a high-speed, catastrophic wreck that would obviously leave him injured and unable to think. His car was simply stuck. Later reports describe it as being in a ditch near a gravel road by the Lincoln County line north of Highway 68. What matters in the moment is that Brandon did not treat it like a life-threatening emergency. He did what a lot of people his age would do. He called home. That call is the center of this case. Almost everything that still matters radiates out from it: the road, the distance, the walk, the final words, the silence. When Brandon called his parents, he said he had put the car in a ditch and could not get it out. He said he was not hurt. He asked them to come get him. There is something almost painfully normal about that request. It sounds like inconvenience, not danger. A son calling his parents because a bad night got a little worse. A story the family would laugh about later. That is what the call sounds like at first, not the opening of an unsolved disappearance, not the last fully known conversation of a 19-year-old who would never make it home. Brian and Annette Swanson got into their truck and started driving to meet him. This is where the case begins to twist in a way that still feels unreal. Brandon believed he was near Lind. Lind is a small town southwest of Marshall. If he had actually been there, the pickup should have been straightforward. His parents knew the area. He knew the area. Even in darkness, the geometry of the problem seemed simple. A car in a ditch, parents on the road, a phone line connecting them until they can spot each other instead. The entire next stretch of time is filled with almost a sexual contact, the kind that is far more disturbing than total disconnection. Brandon and his parents remained on the phone as they tried to line themselves up. The call dropped now and then as cell coverage failed, which was not unusual in that rural area, especially in 2008. But they kept reconnecting. At one point, Brandon tried flashing his car lights so they could see him. His parents flashed theirs. Nothing. No sight of each other, no obvious explanation. The distance between them should have been collapsing, but instead the darkness stayed empty. Imagine what that must have felt like. Inside the truck, every few minutes you expect the puzzle to solve itself. The next hill, the next set of road, the next set of lights in the distance. Surely now, surely this time. But every attempt produces the same answer: no Brandon from his side of the call. The frustration must have been equally intense. because he believed he could see the lights of a town. He believed he understood the area well enough to guide them. He was not speaking like someone who thought he had vanished off the map. He sounded like someone making rational decisions from a mistaken position. That is one of the central mysteries of this case. How wrong was Brandon about his location, and did he ever realize it before the final moment later? Evidence would show he was not near Lind at all. He was in the Porter and Taunton area, around 25 miles away in almost the opposite direction from where he thought he was. That single fact changed everything. It meant the entire search by his parents during the call was happening in the wrong place. The headlights they flashed were invisible to Brandon because they were nowhere near him. The lights Brandon thought belonged to Lind likely belonged to something else entirely. Another town, a farm light, a different fixed point in the darkness that his brain matched to the wrong map, but none of that was known in the moment. In the moment it was only confusion, a phone, dark roads, a son saying he can see town lights, parents who cannot see him at all. The kind of confusion that wastes time without announcing how dangerous the lost time is becoming. Eventually, Brandon made a choice that would define the rest of the case. He decided to leave the car and walk. It is easy to judge that decision from the outside because we know how the story ends, but place yourself in his position as honestly as possible. He had a disabled car, but he was uninjured. He believed he was near a town. He believed his parents were somewhere close. He was 19 and on familiar regional roads, waiting alone beside a ditch in the middle of the night may have felt less sensible than moving toward what he thought was help. So he locked into a plan he would walk toward. The lights he could see his father would head to a meeting point. According to widely reported accounts, Brandon told his father to go to the parking lot of a bar in Lind and wait there while he walked. There is something heartbreaking in how reasonable this sounds, a practical adjustment. No panic, no warning. Just a young man trying to solve a problem with the information he thought he had. He left the car behind and kept talking as he walked. Those final 47 minutes are famous now because they are all that remain of Brandon in real time. There are no surveillance videos, no witnesses who saw the critical moment, no digital breadcrumb trail that maps his exact route across the landscape. There is only the phone call and what his parents remembered hearing through it. Brandon was reportedly describing fences, roads, fields, terrain. He was crossing on foot. At times he sounded irritated by obstacles, but not afraid of them. This is important because it suggests the danger, if danger had already entered the situation, did not feel obvious to him. He was navigating the land as though it was an inconvenience, not a trap. The Minnesota countryside around Taunton and Porter is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There are no cliffs to warn you, no roaring city noise, no giant landmarks that tell you where you stand. It is subtle country drainage. Ditches can be deeper than they look. Creeks and rivers can slip through the land below the level of the road. Farm entrances can appear and vanish in darkness. Tall grass and cultivated fields can erase your sense of distance. A person moving through that environment at night can feel both exposed and invisible at the same time. Brandon kept going. He was talking to the two people most likely to save him. He was moving under the assumption that he was reducing the distance between himself and safety from a narrative point of view. This is what makes the case almost unbearable. He was not isolated in the total sense. He was connected. He was heard. His parents were with him in the only way they could be. And still, whatever happened next happened before anyone could close the final gap sometime. Shortly after 2:30 in the morning, the call reached the moment that would define Brandon Swanson in the public memory forever. He was still talking, still moving, still in the middle of an ordinary sentence. Then he suddenly said, "Oh shit," and stopped. That is the part everyone knows. But the details after it are just as eerie. The line did not immediately fill with obvious signs of catastrophe. There was not a long splash, and there was not a clear crash, and there was not a sequence of sounds that let his parents say with certainty, "This is what happened." There was only silence. They kept listening. They kept calling his name. No answer. Whether the phone remained connected for a short time or the call effectively ended at that moment, the result was the same. The conversation was over, and Brandon never spoke again. Pause there for a moment, because this is the entire mystery compressed into a few seconds. If he slipped into water, why was there no unmistakable sound that his parents recognized? If he fell and was knocked unconscious, where exactly did it happen? And why was no trace of that fall ever confirmed? If another person approached him, why was there no clear sign of a confrontation? If he simply dropped the phone and kept moving, why did he never call back? No matter which explanation you test, those two words remain strangely small compared with the void that follows them. His parents did not stop looking. They continued trying to reach him and continued searching through the night, but they were still searching the wrong area because they still believed Brandon had been near Lind. The most chilling part of the entire timeline may be that after the final words, his parents were still moving through darkness under a false map, still believing he was nearby in one direction when the truth was sitting 25 miles away in another. A case can lose momentum in many ways. This one lost it first through geography. The land itself allowed a fatal misunderstanding to survive long enough. That morning had to arrive before the real search could even begin. There is also something psychologically haunting about the phrase itself. "Oh shit" is not a dramatic farewell. It is not a cry of terror shaped for an audience. It is the reflexive language of sudden recognition. You say it when your foot drops where you did not expect ground to disappear. You say it when a fence gives way, when you see water too late, when you realize the thing in front of you is not what you thought it was. When something ordinary changes into danger in half a second, that is why those words have stayed with people for years. They are not informative, but they are intimate. They preserve the exact instant Brandon understood something was wrong, even though the rest of us never learned what he had seen. And from that point forward, every theory in the case has had to answer one question. What did Brandon suddenly realize in the dark that his parents on the other end of the line could not see? When daylight came, the situation should have become easier to understand. Instead, it became stranger. At around 6:30 in the morning, Brandon was reported missing to police. According to later reporting, the initial response was dismissive. His parents were essentially told that a young adult had a right to be missing, and that it was not unusual for someone his age to stay out all night after the end of college classes. That response would become deeply important later, not only because of what it meant for the first hours of the case, but because it eventually helped change Minnesota law. At the time, though, it added another layer of pain to an already impossible morning. Brandon had not simply failed to come home. He had vanished in the middle of a live phone call after a car accident and a prolonged attempt to find him. His mother knew something was badly wrong. His father knew something was badly wrong. But the system they turned to for urgency did not immediately match the reality they had experienced later. That morning, investigators did begin searching, and once they obtained Brandon's cell phone records, the case shifted in a way few families are ever forced to confront. The records showed Brandon had not been calling from near Lind. He had been calling from the vicinity of Porter and Taunton along Highway 68. That meant the entire live search by his parents during the night had been unfolding in the wrong place. Everything they had done made sense. Based on what Brandon believed, everything failed, because that belief was wrong. When law enforcement searched the Porter and Taunton area, they found his car in a ditch on a gravel road near the Lincoln County line. The discovery answered one question and created several worse ones. Yes, Brandon had really been in trouble. Yes, he had really become stranded, but the car was not wrecked in some catastrophic way that instantly explained his disappearance. Was undamaged enough to fit the original story. A disabled vehicle, a stuck car, a late-night call home. The keys were missing, the doors were reportedly open, and Brandon himself was nowhere in sight. The area around the car now became the critical stage of the investigation. If he had left on foot from there, then somewhere between that ditch and whatever obstacle made him say, Oh shit, the entire case had come apart. You can imagine the emotional violence of that discovery. For his parents, all night they had been trying to force reality to match the phone conversation. By morning, reality finally appeared, and it was 25 miles away from where they had searched. There is no easy way to measure how devastating that must have felt. Not just the fear that their son was gone, but the knowledge that while they were on the phone with him and while they believed they were helping him, every mile they drove was taking them farther from where he actually stood. To understand how Brandon could be so wrong about where he was, you have to picture the region, the way it behaves at night. The rural road system in that part of Minnesota is laid out in a kind of logic that can become deceptive when stripped of detail. Roads run straight for long distances. Intersections repeat gravel branches off from pavement in patterns that feel familiar even when they are not. Small towns glow from far away, but not always in a way that lets you judge distance accurately. A light on the horizon can look closer than it is. A cluster of farm lights can imitate a town. A curve in the road can rotate your internal compass without you noticing. During daylight, those variables are manageable because the land gives you context: field boundaries, road signs, grain elevators, waterways, tree lines. At night, much of that context collapses into silhouette. A person can think he is southwest of Marshall when he is actually northwest of it. And once Brandon told himself he was near Lind, every decision after that may have been filtered through confirmation. The lights he saw became Lind because Lind was the answer already in his head. The roads his parents drove seemed close because he expected them to be close. The mismatch between what he heard from them and what he saw around him did not force an immediate correction because the environment offered too few clues to challenge him. There is another factor that investigators and commentators have returned to over the years. Brandon had been out late. He had consumed some alcohol, according to witnesses. Again, this does not mean he was heavily impaired or incapable of thought, but mild intoxication, combined with darkness, fatigue, and the stress of being stranded, can distort judgment in subtle ways. You do not need a person to be drunk enough to slur or stumble for them to make a serious navigational error. You only need them to be confident while slightly wrong. That may be the most dangerous state in all of this. Not panic, not total confusion, but confidence built on one false assumption. Once the search moved to the correct area, investigators had to ask a new set of questions. What path would Brandon most likely have taken from the car? What landmarks might he have noticed? What obstacle could have triggered those final words? And how could a 19-year-old vanish from open agricultural land without leaving behind a simple answer? This is where the case starts to feel less like a standard missing person incident and more like a structural puzzle. There is a point of origin. There is a narrow time frame. There is a phone call that tracks the subject while he is alive and moving. There is an environment that seems open rather than labyrinthine. Everything about that combination should have produced a usable trail instead. Produced one of the most enduring absences in modern Midwestern mystery. The search around the vehicle was extensive, and over time, it became enormous. But in the first phase, it centered on the most natural possibilities. Maybe Brandon was injured nearby. Maybe he had wandered into a ditch or culvert. Maybe he had reached water. Maybe he had doubled back in the dark and collapsed somewhere hidden by terrain. People unfamiliar with farmland sometimes imagine it as empty, flat visibility with nowhere to hide. In reality, rural ground can conceal more than expected. Drainage cuts sink below the sightline of the road. Tall grasses and crop growth create visual barriers. Creeks twist through low areas. Abandoned farm sites hold old structures and debris. Even an open field becomes hard to read when you are searching for one person, and you do not know if he is alive, unconscious, injured, or already far beyond the original point. Searchers worked roads, ditches, and waterways. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers covered land. The Yellow Medicine River quickly became a major focus because it ran near the area where Brandon likely walked. If he had been moving cross-country at night, He may have encountered it unexpectedly. That would fit the abruptness of his last words. A hidden drop, a steep bank, a sudden slide into water. In many disappearances involving final phone calls, people cling to a single dramatic explanation because it is the only way to transform uncertainty into sequence. He must have fallen into the river. He must have hit his head. He must have drowned before he could respond. This theory has always had power because it lines up with the timing. But like almost everything in this case, it refuses to settle into certainty some canine searches reportedly tracked. Brandon sent to the river. That sounds decisive until you hear what came next. According to reporting, a dog continued across to the other side and then along the bank before heading toward another road where the trail ended. That detail is one of the most important in the entire case, and also one of the most debated in how it should be interpreted. If Brandon went into the river and died there, why would the scent continue beyond it? If he crossed the river and kept moving, why was he never found? If the scent was contaminated or misread, what does that say about the reliability of the most famous path in the case? The yellow medicine theory survives because it explains the last. Words it struggles because it does not explain the total lack of recovery. Rivers hide people, but they do not always keep them forever, especially after focused searches and repeated returns to the area. Sheriff Jack Vizecki reportedly walked portions of the river daily for about a month after Brandon disappeared. Searches resumed when crops were down and visibility improved. Years of effort followed. Still, there was no body and no object clearly tied to Brandon path after the call ended. Try to reconstruct Brandon, final walk step by step, and the case becomes even more unnerving. He leaves the Lumina in the ditch, believing he is near Lind. He begins moving toward lights he thinks belong to town. He remains on the phone with his parents for 47 minutes, which suggests he is covering a meaningful distance, not just standing in one place. He crosses fences and fields. According to what has been reported from the call, that means he is not simply following a straight road shoulder toward a visible business district. He is cutting through rural land in a way that feels more direct to him in the moment. This matters because once you leave the road at night, the environment changes fast. On a road you have edges and direction. Even if you are lost, you are contained by a path in a field or drainage area. You lose that structured distances, become deceptive. Waterways appear without warning. A fence that looks easy to cross becomes a hazard. A low bank can hide a drop. A patch of tall grass can erase landmarks behind you. The popular image of Brandon as a young man calmly walking while talking sometimes hides how dangerous that movement could have been even without foul play. He was not in a controlled corridor. He was improvising through farmland, darkness, and yet his parents did not describe a call filled with fear. That is what makes the situation feel so strange. He was not narrating escalating danger. He was navigating inconvenience. It is possible that his confidence came from his mistaken belief that he was near town and near his parents. If you think help is close, you interpret obstacles differently. A fence is annoying, not ominous. A ditch is a delay, not a warning. A line of trees or brush is just something between you and a parking lot where your father is waiting. There is also the question of pace. 47 minutes is a long time in a disappearance. It is enough time to cover significant distance on foot, especially if you are young and determined. It is also enough time to move farther and farther from the car while leaving investigators with a widening uncertainty cone around your possible route. If Brandon was walking at a steady rate and angling toward the wrong lights, he may have threaded himself through a patchwork of roads, waterways, and private land in a way no one could later recreate with confidence. Searchers would know the start point and the end point of the call. They would not know the exact line between them. And in open country, a missing line is sometimes more devastating than a missing map because the land gives you too many plausible paths and too few reasons to prefer one over another. Every theory about what happened next begins with that invisible walk, The call does not preserve enough sound to show us where Brandon stepped. It only preserves the fact that he was still moving toward what he believed was rescue, until one instant shattered that belief. The river theory deserves to be examined carefully, because it is both the most intuitive explanation and one of the least satisfying. The Yellow Medicine River in that region is not the kind of wide, famous body of water that dominates the landscape from miles away. In places it moves quietly through low ground and can be more dangerous. For that reason, because it is easy to underestimate at night, especially if you are walking cross-country while focused on a phone call, you may not register it until you are close. A steep, muddy bank can collapse underfoot. Narrow crossing point can look easier than it is. Cold water can shut down coordination fast. If Brandon reached the river unexpectedly and slipped, the sequence could have been brutally short. He sees the drop or feels the ground give way, he says. Oh shit. He falls. The phone is lost or submerged. He is injured or stunned. The current takes over. That is the clean version of the theory. It explains the abruptness. It explains why no further words came. It explains why he was never heard moving away or calling for help. But as soon as you look at the evidence, problems appear. One problem is the sound issue. People often assume his parents would have heard a splash or struggle if he fell into water. That assumption may be weaker than it feels, because cell phones in 2008 on rural networks did not capture every subtle sound well, and the geometry of a fall can reduce what carries through. A person slipping down a bank into brush and shallow moving water may not create the dramatic noise people imagine. So the absence of a clear splash does not rule the theory out. The much bigger problem is recovery. If Brandon entered the river near the focus area, why was he never found? Despite repeated searches, bodies in water can be missed. Objects can lodge in debris. Rural rivers can complicate recovery with vegetation, mud, and changing conditions. But the total absence of confirmed remains or personal items, after all these years, makes the theory harder to accept with confidence. Then there is the dog track, reported to continue beyond the water. That detail cuts directly against a simple drowning scenario, unless the dog was following residual scent rather than body movement, or unless the interpretation of the track has been overstated. In retellings, search dog evidence is powerful but not magical. It requires handling conditions, timing, and cautious reading. A dog crossing water does not automatically prove the subject crossed in the same way a stopped trail does not automatically prove abduction. Still, the continuation of scent beyond the river is one reason Brandon's mother has publicly said she does not believe there is enough to indicate he is in the water. There is also the issue of the final phrase itself, "oh shit," could fit a fall into a river, but it could fit dozens of other sudden realizations too. A misstep into a hole, a fence collapse, a surprise encounter with another person, a drop into a creek bed, a jolt of pain from injury. The river theory works best when people want the case to be explainable. It works worst when tested against the stubborn fact that the landscape around that river has been searched with unusual persistence and still refuses to return Brandon. A second possibility is that Brandon did not die in the river at all, but was injured somewhere on land and later succumbed to exposure or disorientation in a sandbar place searchers somehow missed. This theory becomes more believable when you remember how deceptive agricultural land can be after dark. A person can step into a drainage channel deeper than expected. He can fall over an embankment. He can catch a leg in old wire or debris near an abandoned farm site. He can strike his head hard enough to become confused without dying immediately. If that happened after the last words, Brandon may have been alive for some time, but unable to call back or move effectively. That would create a cruel window in which survival might have depended on being found quickly. The obvious objection is the same, one that haunts most land-based theories in this case. Where is he? How do repeated searches fail to locate a body in relatively open country? This question seems simple until you examine how searches actually work. A line of volunteers can cover a field, and still miss what lies in. Dense vegetation, low ground brush, or hidden depressions. Seasonal growth changes everything. Crops rise. Snowfalls, water levels, shift ground that looks easy in 1 month, becomes visually impenetrable in another if Brandon fell into a concealed location and later became covered by natural processes. The difficulty of finding him increases sharply. There have been cases elsewhere where remains were eventually discovered, shockingly close to areas searched. Before that fact keeps the injury and exposure theory alive. It does not solve the case, but it reminds us that search failure does not automatically imply impossibility. Yet there is still an emotional mismatch here. Brandon was talking for a long time after leaving the car. If he was navigating normally for much of that walk, then whatever happened at the end was sudden, a random fall severe enough to silence him forever as possible. But would it truly leave no recoverable trace? No phone, no clothing, no fragment of remains found by searchers, volunteers, dogs, or chance over the years? The longer you sit with that absence, the more land-based accident theories begin to feel thin, and still they cannot be dismissed, because Brandon may have crossed into precisely the kind of terrain most likely to produce a small, invisible disaster, the hardest truth in missing person work is that ordinary terrain can become lethal without looking dramatic. A creek bed hidden by brush, a culvert, a low marshy stretch, a spot where one step is safe and the next is not. If Brandon died this way, the Jew case becomes less supernatural and more tragic. Not a mystery created by impossible forces, but by the terrible efficiency of darkness and geography. And perhaps that version is harder in a different way, because it would mean he was close enough to rescue for 47 minutes and still slipped through the world, because one unseen part of the land reached up at exactly the wrong time. Then there is the theory that many people resist at first because it introduces another person into an already crowded uncertainty. Foul play, the argument for foul play, usually begins with the end of the scent trail and the impossibility of finding Brandon after such a long and highly public search. If he was moving on foot through rural land, at night he was vulnerable, not because someone was necessarily out hunting for a victim, but because isolation creates opportunity. A passing vehicle on a gravel road, a person at a nearby property, someone who saw a confused young man alone and understood immediately that no witness was close enough to matter. The most unsettling version of this theory is not a planned abduction. It is an opportunistic encounter. Brandon emerges from fields or near a road. After the final words, maybe he is injured or disoriented. Maybe he asks for help. Maybe the wrong person stops in that scenario. The abrupt silence on the call could mark the moment he stumbled, or the moment he saw headlights, or the moment he encountered someone before he could process the danger. The theory is difficult to prove because the case lacks obvious signs of violence around the vehicle and around the presumed route. There was no blood trail made public, no witness placing another person at the key moment, no object from Brandon recovered in a way that clearly indicated criminal disposal. And yet law enforcement has reportedly not ruled foul play out. That matters. Investigators who spend years in a case usually narrow what they consider plausible. The fact that a criminal explanation remains on the table suggests the evidence never settled into a clean, accidental narrative. Critics of the foul play theory point out that rural Minnesota is not a place where random predatory encounters should be assumed by default. That is, fair but rare does not mean impossible. A single unplanned meeting on a dark road is all this theory requires. There is another version that focuses less on random danger and more on the possibility that Brandon was not entirely alone after leaving the parties that night. Could someone have followed him? Could there have been an interaction from earlier in the evening that was never recognized as significant? Most available reporting does not provide evidence strong enough to build that scenario with confidence. Friends did not describe major conflict. No public fact places a known threat on his path home. So if foul play occurred, It may have been sudden and situational rather than connected to a visible earlier motive. What keeps the theory alive is not strong positive evidence. It is negative space, the sense that an accidental explanation should have left more behind than this case ever did. Sometimes in true mystery, the move toward foul play does not happen because the evidence screams it. It happens because every natural explanation feels one piece short. Brandon case lives in that uneasy territory. No one can point to a clear assailant. No one can dismiss the possibility that after the final words he reached a road and someone else decided what the rest of his life would be. Another reason Brandon Swanson case continues to fascinate people is that it sits at the edge between the old world of missing person investigations and the digital world people now expect. Today, many viewers instinctively ask for the things this case does not have. What about GPS? What about exact location sharing? What about a phone ping precise enough to draw a circle around the final words? In 2008, that level of immediate consumer tracking was not part of ordinary life. The way many people now imagine cell records could place Brandon in the Porter and Taunton area after the fact, but they could not reconstruct every step of his walk in real time with the precision modern audiences have learned to expect. That technological gap is one reason the case feels both close and unreachable. We have more than old mysteries usually give us. We have a live call. We have a broad area. We have a stranded vehicle. We have a known final phrase. But we do not have enough to turn any of that into a precise route. The phone itself was never recovered publicly as far as the known case information shows. That missing phone matters enormously. If found, it could potentially have answered basic questions. Did it fall in water? Did it remain on land? Did it move after the call? Did someone turn it off? Was there damage consistent with a fall or submersion? Without it, the final seconds remain abstract, just words and silence. It is also worth remembering how fragile calls could be in rural coverage zones at the time. Dropped calls and patchy audio were normal. That means some people may place too much confidence in the absence of certain sounds. The call was a lifeline, but it was not a perfect recording of reality. It was a narrow audio channel shaped by distance, towers, battery conditions, and the bid limitations of the device itself. Still, the call gives one crucial emotional truth that has resisted erosion. Brandon did not sound like someone planning to disappear. He sounded like someone trying to get home. His father later recalled that Brandon did not seem especially confused in conversation. Despite the location error, that detail is important because it challenges a simplistic version of the intoxication theory. He may have been wrong about where he was, but wrong and incoherent are not the same thing. He was capable enough to coordinate with his parents for nearly an hour, capable enough to keep walking, capable enough to stay engaged in a practical plan that makes the final break harder to explain with broad labels like drunk or lost. He was those things at most in limited ways. He was also functioning, thinking, solving, moving, and then suddenly not reachable by any method that mattered. A lot of unsolved cases depend on missing information. Brandon case depends on almost enough information. And that is often much worse. As the weeks turned into months, the search for Brandon expanded far beyond what most missing adult cases ever received. This was not one quick sweep and a few posters on telephone poles. Hundreds of volunteers eventually helped cover the area. More than 30 dog handlers were involved, according to local reporting about later searches. More than 100 square miles were searched over the years. That number alone tells you how the case evolved. What began as a phone call tied to a ditch became a regional hunt across fields, waterways, roads, and hidden low-ground. Searches resumed when crop conditions changed. That detail is easy to overlook if you are used to urban cases, but in Brandon case, agriculture controlled visibility. Fields planted soon after his disappearance, limited access and sight lines. Investigators and volunteers had to wait for harvests or seasonal windows when the land could be properly searched again. That means time kept interfering with certainty. By the time one area became easier to examine, months might have already passed, and whatever trace Brandon left could have been altered by weather, water animals, equipment, or growth. In some ways, the case became a race against the landscape, and the landscape kept winning. There were also moments over the years when potential clues created brief surges of hope. Search dogs hit on areas northwest of Porter at one point. Canines reportedly alerted to a bone in a field during a later search, but it was eventually determined not to be human. These moments matter emotionally because they show how the case has operated for Brandon's family and for the people helping them. Not as a cold file resting untouched in a cabinet, but as a living wound that periodically opens with possibility and then closes again with disappointment. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension eventually took over as lead agency, and a tip line was established. Leads came in search managers revisited areas. Attention returned at anniversaries. Through all of it, the fundamental fact did not move: Brandon still had not been found. When a case receives that level of sustained attention and still yields nothing, the public tends to split into camps. One camp sees the absence as proof of a hidden criminal act. The other sees it as proof that natural terrain can conceal. More than common sense allows Brandon's case gives neither side a clean victory. The searches were too serious to dismiss. The failure was too complete to make accident feel comfortable. This is why the story persists. It exists in the narrow band where effort and evidence should have converged, but never did. Every additional search proves how much people cared and how difficult the land could be. Every unsuccessful search also deepens the feeling that whatever happened to Brandon did not behave the way a simple accident should behave. There is another layer to this case that often gets lost beneath the famous last words and the maps and the SMAPs. Theories. The family aftermath. For Brandon parents, the disappearance did not freeze at the moment of silence. It continued every night and every morning afterward. They left their porch light on as a sign that Brandon could come home. Years passed, and that light remained part of the story. It became a symbol of hope, but also of the particular cruelty of an unresolved disappearance. When someone dies, the grief is overwhelming, but it has a shape. When someone vanishes, the grief becomes recursive. Every possibility stays alive, just enough to reopen itself. Maybe he is injured somewhere. Maybe he is alive and cannot come back. Maybe the next search will find him. Maybe the next tip matters. Maybe the next anniversary will be different. That endless rotation of hope and dread is one reason Brandon's case resonates so strongly with people who have never even been to Minnesota. Almost everyone can imagine a late night call from someone they love. Almost everyone can imagine dropping everything to go help. Almost no one can bear the thought of being on the phone when that person crosses some invisible line and vanishes before your voice can pull them back. For Brian and Annette, the memory is not abstract. They do not remember a news story. They remember their son speaking in the present tense. They remember trying to line up roads and lights and landmarks while the phone connected them across the dark. They remember hearing the final phrase and then never hearing his voice again. Cases like this often harden into internet puzzles where strangers debate possibilities as if they are pieces on a board. But for the family, the case is not a puzzle. It is an interruption that never finished a drive home, that never reached home a pickup, that never happened. A morning that warning never stopped becoming worse. That emotional truth also shapes how theories should be handled. It is easy to become dramatic and irresponsible around unresolved disappearances, especially when the evidence is thin, but every wild claim placed onto Brandon's final minutes does more than entertain an audience. It risks turning his absence into a spectacle detached from the people who have lived inside it for years. The reason this story deserves attention, not because it invites fantasy, it is because it shows how fragile ordinary life can be and how devastating it is when a single missing hour denies a family the most basic form of truth. Where is he? What happened? Was he scared? Did he suffer? Did anyone hurt him? Could he have been saved? Those questions do not age out of the house, where the porch light stays on. They keep living there long after the headlines move on, one of the few concrete changes to come from this case was legal after experiencing the initial resistance when they reported Brandon missing his parents, pushed for reform. The result became known as Brandon Law. In Minnesota, the law requires law enforcement to accept reports of missing persons without delay and to begin a preliminary investigation rather than dismissing adult disappearances with the idea that the person simply has a right to be missing. That phrase has become infamous in connection with this case, and for good reason. Legally, an adult can choose to leave. That is true, but in practice, the phrase can become a shield for inaction during the exact early window when action matters most. Brandon case exposed that danger in a brutal way. He was not an adult who quietly chose not to call home for a while. He was a 19-year-old who had just spent 47 minutes on the phone with his parents after putting his car in a ditch. He had vanished under circumstances that were obviously unusual, and yet, even in a case like that, the first reaction was not full urgency. Brandon Law did not solve Brandon disappearance, and no legislation can erase what happened in those hours, but it did create something larger than one case file. It turned a private loss into public protection for future families. There is a sad nobility in that. Part of the story, parents who never got their son back still forced the system to become more responsive to the next person who might vanish under dangerous circumstances. Whenever people talk about Brandon now, they usually mention the call and the words and the mystery. They should also remember the law, because it shows how unresolved cases can still reshape the world around them. It also underscores just how strong Annette and Brian had to become. Many families are destroyed by the emotional weight of uncertainty alone. The Swansons carried that uncertainty and then stepped into the public process of reform. That does not mean they moved on. It means they refused to let the indifference they encountered remain normal. There is another reason this legal legacy matters in the context of the case itself. It reminds us that timing is everything in missing person investigations. Hours matter. The quality of the first response matters. Whether police believe the family matters. Brandon's story is not only a mystery about where he went after the final call, it is also a cautionary story about what happens when a disappearance enters bureaucracy before it enters urgency. By the time the search focused on the correct location, precious time had already bled away into the wrong map. No law can tell us whether that changed the outcome in Brandon's case, but the existence of Brandon Law suggests that many people understood the lesson clearly enough to try to prevent it from happening again. Let us slow the case down even more and focus on the actual geography around the car, because this is where Brandon's final minutes stop. Feeling abstract and start feeling tactile. His vehicle was found off a gravel road near the Lincoln County line, north of Highway 68 in the Taunton area. That means Brandon was not stranded on a bright shoulder beside a clearly marked route home. He was in the kind of place where one road can look interchangeable with another, and where the nearest sign of civilization may exist only as a glow on the horizon. From the car, he apparently believed town lights were visible. If those lights were not limned, then what were they? This question sounds minor, but it sits at the heart of the navigation error. He might have been seeing lights from Porter. He might have been seeing a farm site or industrial lighting that resembled a town from his angle. He might have been translating a cluster of distant points into the answer his mind already expected. Humans are much worse at orienting in darkness than we like to admit. Give the brain a vague reference, and it will often complete the picture before the eyes have earned that confidence. If Brandon then chose to walk directly toward those lights, he may have been taking a route that made sense geometrically, but not safely. A direct line through farmland is rarely truly direct. It crosses property lines, drainage areas, fences, streams, brush and uneven ground. A road bends around hazards. A person on foot at night may cut straight into them. Some later analyses of the case have emphasized how his likely route would have brought him near the Yellow Medicine River and near creeks or drainage channels. That does not prove he entered one of them, but it shows how his walk could have converged with hidden hazards even while he felt he was moving sensibly. And remember, he was on the phone. Being on the phone does not make a person helpless, but it divides attention. A call can anchor you emotionally while reducing what you notice physically. Brandon may have been more focused on communicating progress to his parents than on reading each change in the land beneath him. The route also matters because of how little of it can be recreated with certainty. We know where the car was. We know approximately how long the call lasted after he left it. We know there were obstacles. We know there was a sudden break, but there is no single published path everyone agrees on. That uncertainty opens room for every theory. River injury, road encounter, misadventure at an abandoned property. Each possibility claims a slightly different version of the same dark walk. The map, therefore, does not close the case. It multiplies it. Every line you draw from the car toward the lights becomes a separate story about what Brandon might have reached in the final seconds before his words cut off the parents' perspective deserves its own close look, because it is the only human record we have of Brandon's final state of mind. Brian and Annette were not reading a transcript after the fact. They were living the call in real time while driving dark roads and trying to make sense of conflicting signals. That matters because memory under stress can distort some details while preserving others with painful sharpness. They heard their son as calm enough to communicate. They heard him trying to solve the problem. They did not hear the kind of fear that would make them think he was in immediate mortal danger. And that is one reason the final silence hit so violently. If the whole call had been chaotic, then the ending would have felt like the tragic climax of obvious danger. Instead, the danger arrives like a trapdoor. Under an otherwise manageable conversation, there is also the painful fact that they were participating in the sequence that led to the final walk. That is not blame. It is what families often carry anyway. What if we had told him to stay in the car? What if we had insisted he stop moving? What if we had immediately called authorities, even though he sounded okay? What if we had realized sooner that the location made no sense? These questions are natural and merciless. They survive even when logic says the parents acted the way countless others would have acted. A son calls late at night, says he is stuck but unhurt, and asks for a ride. You go get him. If he says he is walking toward lights while talking to you, the situation may sound inconvenient and frustrating, but not beyond control. That is why this case reaches so many people on such a personal level. It is built out of choices most families would recognize as reasonable. Nothing in the call announces the scale of the disaster to come. At the same time, the parents' perspective also limits the investigation because their memory is all we have. There is no preserved audio released to the public, no independent listener who can revisit tone, cadence, background sounds with forensic neutrality. The world knows Brandon's last moments only through those who loved him most and who were under unimaginable stress while hearing them. Some skeptics use that to question details of the call that can quickly become unfair. Trauma may blur exact sequence, but it does not invent the core event. A long call happened. The parents could not find him, he said. Oh shit. Then silence. Those pillars of the case are solid, even if smaller elements around them remain uncertain. And because those pillars are solid, the emotional architecture of the case never weakens. It stays terrible in the same way year after year. A mother and father were on the phone with their son as he walked through darkness toward what he believed was safety, and they could do nothing except listen until the world on his side of the call changed forever. Any serious discussion of Brandon case also has to address the explanations that are technically possible, but widely seen as weak. Intentional disappearances. One of them, because Brandon was legally an adult, and because there was initial police resistance based on that fact, some people naturally ask whether he chose to vanish. In pure theory, almost any missing adult can choose to leave. In practice, the circumstances here make that idea difficult to support. He called his parents for help after getting his car stuck. He stayed on the phone with them for nearly an hour. He sounded engaged in the immediate problem in front of him. His vehicle was left behind in a ditch, not arranged as part of a staged disappearance plan. There has been no known evidence of a second life waiting for him. No financial preparation, no established motive, strong enough to explain why a 19-year-old would create such a chaotic and risky exit while speaking live to his parents. People do reinvent themselves and disappear intentionally, but they usually do not do it by crashing into a ditch calling family, and then improvising through darkness while maintaining contact until an abrupt final phrase. That path creates too much chaos and too little control for an intentional vanishing. Suicide is another theory that sometimes appears in online discussion because unresolved disappearances tend to attract it almost automatically. Again, the known facts do not strongly support it. Nothing public suggests Brandon was expressing suicidal intent that night. The structure of the call does not sound like farewell or withdrawal. It sounds like problem solving. That does not make suicide impossible because private suffering can remain hidden, but it means the peace. Theory lacks affirmative evidence and often functions more as a way for people to force closure onto uncertainty than as a reading grounded in the record. What is striking about these weaker theories is how often they emerge simply because the stronger theories also fail to satisfy. When accident leaves no body and foul play leaves no suspect, people start reaching for explanations that fit the absence rather than the evidence that is understandable but dangerous. The honest position in Brandon's case is narrower and more uncomfortable. We know a great deal about the beginning. We know almost nothing certain about the end. That gap invites projection. Some see hidden despair, some see secret plans, some see a random predator, some see a simple fall into water. The truth may be dramatically simpler than any of those stories or more complex than all of them. What matters is not to confuse plausibility with proof. Brandon's case has survived precisely because so many explanations can be narrated from the same small set of facts, and none of them can fully own those facts without leaving something important behind. The dog evidence in Brandon's case deserves a deeper look because it is one of those elements people cite with great confidence, even though it may be more ambiguous than it first appears. Canine searches can be incredibly valuable. Dogs detect patterns humans cannot, and in many missing person cases, they help narrow terrain or confirm that a subject passed through a specific corridor. But dog work is not the same as a video recording. It is sensitive to time, weather, contamination, handling, and the exact type of scent task the animal is performing. Public retellings often flatten all of that complexity into a simple statement like the dogs tracked him to the river. That summary is not wrong in spirit, but it is incomplete in effect, because what matters is what the track did after the river and how investigators interpreted it. Accounts have stated that a dog followed Brandon's scent to the Terp Yellow Medicine River, then continued on the far side and eventually moved along the bank toward another road before the trail ended. If accurate, that sequence opens several possibilities. Brandon may have crossed the water somehow, though. Crossing at night would itself be hazardous and raises further questions about why he was never found beyond it. The scent may have transferred in a way that makes the route less literal than it sounds. Environmental conditions may have complicated what the dog was indicating, or the final movement toward a road could suggest that Brandon reached a point where another variable entered the story, perhaps a vehicle, perhaps a heavily traveled surface where scent becomes harder to isolate. None of those interpretations can be proved from the publicly known details alone. That is why people who use the dog track to declare certainty often oversell the evidence. At the same time, the track cannot be dismissed because it is one of the few investigative elements that appears to extend Brandon's path beyond the simple idea that he fell directly into the river and vanished there. It keeps the case open in a practical sense. If the dog work suggested movement past the water, then searchers cannot responsibly end the story at the first riverbank. This is part of what made the search so frustrating. Each clue pushed the possibility field wider rather than narrowing it. The car established a start point. The cell records corrected the geography. The dogs may have expanded the route, but none of it created closure. In fact, The more layers you add, the more Brandon seems to dissolve into the landscape rather than stand out from it. That is a deeply unusual effect in an investigation. Usually more data sharpens the picture. Here, more data seemed to prove only that Brandon was moving through a complex environment. No one could finally lock into a single line. The dogs did not fail the case. They may have shown just enough to demonstrate how hard the case really is, and perhaps that is what makes their involvement so haunting. They may have gotten closer to Brandon's final movements than any human ever did, and even that was not enough to bring him back into view. There is a category of explanation that sits between accident and foul play and often gets less attention than it deserves. Man-made hazards in rural terrain. When people hear open farmland, they imagine empty, safe ground. But rural land is full of structures and features that can become dangerous at night. Old wells, collapsed foundations, culverts, drainage pipes, barbed wire, discarded machinery, steep ditch walls, small bridges, fences with unstable footing, abandoned farmsteads with hidden holes and debris buried by grass. A person crossing that environment by moonlight or starlight while distracted by a phone conversation can move from safety to serious danger in one bad step. This theory has power because it matches the suddenness of the final words without requiring water or another person. Brandon could have stepped into something, fallen through something, or become trapped in a space searchers did not immediately consider. A narrow culvert filled with water and vegetation, for example, can hide a body with brutal efficiency. So can a depression concealed by crop growth or an old farm feature outside the stun. First, search assumptions. There is a reason experienced search managers often say terrain can be much more deceptive than outsiders believe. Land is not simply land. It is a history of use layered over natural drainage and seasonal change. Brandon's path may have crossed one of those hidden histories at exactly the wrong moment. The limitation of this theory is familiar by now. Would all the later searches really miss a man-made hazard containing remains? Maybe. Not, but maybe the right hazard was outside the highest priority zones, or inaccessible during critical early windows, or altered by weather and agricultural activity before searchers knew where to look. The longer a case stays unsolved, the easier it is to imagine investigators must have already checked every plausible place. In practice, no search can check everywhere equally, and some hazards remain functionally invisible until chance exposes them years later. What makes this theory especially compelling in Brandon's case is the lack of dramatic evidence. No loud crash on the phone, no sign of a struggle, no clear splash, just a reflexive phrase and silence that feels exactly like a person discovering with one step that the environment is not what he thought it was. The phrase does not sound like someone entering a long, terrifying encounter. It sounds like immediate recognition, a brief instant of understanding followed by an event too fast or too disabling to overcome. Even so, the theory does not close the case because it suffers from the same problem as river accident and exposure. No confirmed recovery, no object, no final location. Every theory in Brandon's case can explain the first few seconds after, oh shit. None of them can comfortably explain the years that followed and found nothing. There is also an important investigative concept at work here that rarely gets enough attention outside search and rescue circles. The difference between a point last seen and a point last known. Brandon's car is a hard last known point. The beginning of his walk is therefore anchored in physical reality. But after he left the car, his route becomes only partially known through the phone call. That means his last seen point, in the true visual sense, does not exist for investigators. No one watched him cross the first fence. No one saw the bank he may have approached. No one can say with certainty where he was standing when he said his final words. This distinction matters because searches are only as precise as the last reliable point allows. If the point is broad, then the search area grows exponentially. In Brandon's case, that broadening is hidden by the emotional intensity of the phone call. Because he was being heard, we feel as though he was being observed. He was not. He was audible, but still physically alone in darkness. That creates a dangerous illusion of control. His parents knew more than most families ever get in a disappearance. At the same time, they still did not know enough to direct rescuers to the exact place where danger entered the story. A search built around an approximate moving subject can lose efficiency. Fast, especially when the subject is walking away from the car for nearly an hour. Every minute extends the possible area, every fence, crossed and field cut through compounds uncertainty. And if the critical event happened near a waterway that then carried or concealed evidence, the uncertainty multiplies again. This is one reason the case should not be treated as impossible. Even though it feels impossible, it is entirely possible for a person to vanish from a search if the final known route is wider than people realize. Yet there is a counter-truth here too. Cases built on such uncertainty usually produce at least fragments over time. A phone found by chance, a shoe, a bone, a wallet. Something Brandon case remains powerful because it combines a broadening route problem with a nearly total lack of subsequent material evidence. Both truths have to be held together at once. The search space may have been larger and more deceptive than common sense suggests, and the absence of later discovery is still remarkable. That is why the case keeps resisting closure. It contains enough ordinary search logic to stay grounded and enough missing evidence to remain deeply unsettling. You can explain the mechanics without feeling satisfied by them. In fact, the more you understand the mechanics, the more you recognize how a person can disappear into a dark landscape while still feeling that someone somewhere should have found something by now. Why does Brandon Swanson case linger in public memory more than so many other disappearances from the same era? Part of the answer is structural. The story contains a perfect hook, a stranded car, a call to parents, 47 minutes of live conversation, 2 final words. Then nothing. Human attention is drawn to edges, and this case lives on an edge most mysteries never reach. We feel as if the truth should be just on the other side of the call. One more sound, one better tower ping, one witness on the right road, one successful search in the right season. One more piece, and the whole thing should click into place. That psychological closeness keeps people returning. The case also stands out because it strips away many of the distractions that muddy other disappearances. There is no sprawling urban suspect pool, no endless surveillance maze, no years of conflicting tabloid narratives, no obvious personal chaos at the center of the story. Instead, we get a young man trying to get home and a landscape refusing to tell us what happened to him. That simplicity makes the mystery feel purer and more brutal. It is not crowded with storylines. It is defined by a single, missing transition. How did Brandon move from talking and walking to permanent silence? There is another reason the case remains so affecting. It reveals a form of danger people rarely respect until it is too late. Rural darkness. Modern culture often teaches us to fear cities or wilderness extremes, while treating farmland as benign in between. But Brandon case suggests how wrong that instinct can be. A patchwork of roads, fields, waterways, and private land can be more disorienting than a forest if you think you know it well enough not to fear it. The case becomes a warning against overconfidence in familiar places. You do not have to enter a remote mountain range to become lost. You only need darkness, a few wrong assumptions, and one moment where the lamb stops behaving the way you expected. For creators and audiences of mystery content, the case also occupies a rare ethical space. It is gripping without requiring sensational violence. The horror comes from recognition, not spectacle. Most viewers can imagine being Brandon. Most viewers can imagine being his parents. That shared human plausibility gives the mystery emotional longevity. Even people who do not normally follow missing person cases remember this one because it feels less like an alien nightmare and more like a normal life being cut apart by one incomprehensible gap. And maybe that is the deepest reason the story persists. It attacks the comforting belief that if we stay on the phone with someone long enough, if we keep talking, if we keep trying to guide them, then we can. Hold them in the world. Brandon Case says sometimes even a voice is not enough. Let us take the final moment itself and test the leading possibilities against the limited facts. One by one, scenario 1 is the sudden fall into water. This works with the phrase, "It works with the nearby river and creeks." It works with the abrupt stop. It struggles with the lack of recovery, and with reports of scent continuing beyond the water. Scenario 2 is a fall onto land severe enough to knock Brandon unconscious or disable him immediately. This also fits the phrase, and the silence, it fits hidden terrain hazards. It struggles with the same long-term absence, especially after repeated searches. Scenario 3 is that Brandon encountered a road or property, and a second party entered the story. This can explain why the trail effectively ends and why nothing is found in the expected natural path. It struggles because there is no confirmed evidence of another person, and because the leap from possibility to certainty is too large. Scenario 4 is a combination event. Brandon falls or is injured, and later another process hides what remains, whether water movement, weather, animals, agricultural activity, or simple search failure. Combination theories often feel more realistic, because real life rarely follows a single neat mechanism. They also become harder to test because each stage can absorb the weakness of the last. Scenario 5 is that our understanding of the route is flawed from the start, and the decisive event happened in a place searchers did not prioritize strongly enough. This theory has quiet power because every investigation depends on the quality of its map. If Brandon walked in an arc different from the assumed one, then some later conclusions may have grown out of a mistaken route. What all these scenarios share is that the final phrase acts as a hinge, not an answer. It tells us Brandon perceived danger or surprise. It does not tell us the category of that danger. The reason people become obsessed with the words is because they are the closest thing to a witness statement from the event itself. But they are not a statement in any meaningful sense. They are a reflex, a flash of consciousness before the story. Swallowed. And perhaps that is why no theory ever settles comfortably. Each theory can occupy the phrase for a moment, and then gets pushed back out by the rest of the case. The river gets blocked by missing evidence. Foul play gets blocked by missing indicators. Injury gets blocked by search history. Intentional disappearance gets blocked by behavior and context. The phrase belongs to all the explanations and to none of them. It is the smallest piece of reed evidence and somehow the largest object in the whole case, because those two words are the only moment where Brandon and the truth were still in the same place. One of the most underrated features of this mystery is the total absence of ordinary leftovers. When people vanish unexpectedly, they often leave fragments: a phone shattered in a ditch, a shoe caught in mud, a wallet dropped in grass, keys, glasses, bits of clothing. Something, even if the person is never recovered. The event usually scatters evidence because human movement through crisis is messy. Brandon Case gives us the car, and then almost nothing else that can be placed with confidence after he started walking. That includes the phone. If the phone had been found in water, the river theory would feel stronger. If it had been found on land far from the river, then other theories would gain weight. If it had shown movement after the call that could point toward another person. But the phone does not return in the public record, and that absence becomes its own kind of clue. Either it remains hidden in the environment, or whatever happened to Brandon carried the phone beyond where searchers looked. Both options are troubling. The agricultural character of the area deepens this problem. Land there does not remain static from season to season. Equipment crosses. Fields, crops grow, and our cut water levels change. Sediment shifts. Vegetation thickens, and then dies back. A small object can disappear into that cycle almost instantly. A body can become harder to see, a clue missed in the first. Days may not become easier to find later. Sometimes it becomes functionally unrecoverable without pure luck. This is one reason people should resist the simplistic argument that open land means obvious search conditions. Open to the eye is not the same as open to discovery. A field can be broad and still hide details at ground level. incredibly well, a drainage area can look empty from 10 yards away and be visually impenetrable when you are trying to detect one dark object or one set of remains among natural debris. Still, the absence of all personal effects remains one of the strongest points in favor of theories involving either water transport or human intervention. Natural land accidents often leave fragments. Total disappearance from a route involving fences, fields, and rough ground feels harder to accept without some secondary process helping erase the trace. Once again, the case refuses to give an easy lesson. The lack of objects is meaningful, but it is meaningful in multiple directions at once. It suggests how complete the disappearance was. It also reminds us how little of Brandon's final environment was truly under control once daylight and certainty failed to arrive together. After all the theories and maps and search reports, there is a simpler way to describe why Brandon Swanson case still feels unresolved at a deeper level. The story stops at the exact place where stories are supposed to continue. A problem occurs. Help is called, movement towards safety begins. Then, instead of resolution, there is a blank, not a broad blank covering days or weeks, but a blank opening in the middle of an active rescue by family. That structure makes the case feel wrong in a way many other disappearances do not. It is one thing for someone to fail to arrive home and only later be noticed missing. It is another for a family to be actively engaged in the rescue while the missing person is still talking and still be unable to prevent the disappearance. That is why the case is not only mysterious but cruel. It teaches the audience that proximity is not protection, that being in contact is not the same as being safe, that a voice can hold someone close enough to break your heart while still leaving them physically beyond your reach. For investigators, the unresolved part may always be practical. No confirmed final location. No remains, no conclusive evidence of accident or crime. For the public, the unresolved part is often emotional. How can young man walk and talk for nearly an hour in open country and simply never reappear? The answer may ultimately be less exotic than people imagine. He may have suffered a very ordinary accident in a very unforgiving landscape, but even if that is true, the ordinary nature of the event would not make it easier to absorb. In some ways, it would make it worse, because then Brandon was not taken by some grand impossible force. He was taken by the small blind spots in human judgment and by the parts of the world we call familiar until they prove otherwise. The other possibility, of course, is that someone else entered the story and ended it. That possibility keeps a different kind of fear alive, not fear of the land, but fear of who might be waiting in the margins of isolation, where one road and one random meeting can erase a life, whichever version is closest to the truth. The case leaves us with the same final image: a young man in the dark, believing that each step is taking him toward home. A father listening, a mother waiting, a sentence cut in half, and a silence large enough to last for years. Before we close, there are a handful of questions that still define the case more clearly than any theory does. What lights was Brandon actually seeing when he believed he was near Lind? Did he ever realize during the call that he was in the wrong place, or did he remain confident in the wrong map until the final second? What obstacle made him say, "Oh shit"? Was it water, a sudden drop, a fence, a hole, a person? Did he remain near that obstacle after the call ended, or did he continue moving in some impaired state? Why has no personal item been recovered in a way that decisively resolves the route? Why did the scent evidence appear to complicate the river theory instead of confirming it? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, if the search area around his likely path has been worked so many times across so many seasons, what does that say about the true nature of the place where Brandon ended up? Questions like these are why the case remains alive in documentaries, articles, forums, and family memory. Not because the mystery is flashy, but because it feels one layer away from solvable, one correct turn on the road that night, and his parents pick him up, and the story dies there. One better location fix, and rescuers start in the right place at first light. One witness on a gravel road, and the final minutes gain shape one discovered object, and a theory hardens into fact. Instead, every crucial piece is missing. By just enough, the effect is like standing outside a locked room while hearing movement on the other side. You know there is an answer in there. You know the prod. Answer has weight and shape. You just never get the key. Brandon Swanson has now been missing for years, and the essential truth has not changed. He left a celebration. He drove into a ditch. He called his parents. He walked through the dark, believing he was heading toward help. He said, "Oh shit," and then the world gave nothing back. That is not just the outline of a case. It is the outline of a nightmare built from normal decisions, a wrong turn, a stuck car, a phone call home, a walk across familiar country. No monsters required, no impossible weather, no dramatic setting. Just the terrible fact that sometimes the space between a person and safety is not measured in miles. It is measured in one unseen step. If there is one lesson in Brandon's story, it may be this: never mistake contact for certainty. A voice on the phone can make us feel that we understand the danger because we are inside the moment with the person we love. But hearing someone is not the same as seeing them. Knowing their destination is not the same as knowing their location. And familiar land is not the same as safe land. Brandon case collapses all of those assumptions at once. It shows how quickly a manageable problem can turn into a permanent absence. It shows how darkness can turn a map into a guess. It shows how an ordinary environment can hide in hand extraordinary loss. And it shows how families are left carrying not only grief, but also unfinished motion. The truck ride that should have ended with a son climbing into the passenger seat never reached that ending, the passenger seat. Conversation that should have become a story told over breakfast never reached its final line. Somewhere in rural Minnesota, a young man moving toward help crossed into a reality no one has been able to reconstruct. Maybe the truth is resting in the river mud. Maybe it lies in land that has been searched and still kept its secret. Maybe another human being saw him in those last minutes and never came forward until the case is solved. All of those possibilities remain in the dark with him. Thank you for watching Silent Echo. If you want more long-form mysteries and disappearances told with full detail and careful analysis, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It really helps the channel grow, and it helps more people find these stories. And if you have a case you want covered next, let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe. There is another cruel aspect to this case that only becomes clear when you think about time not as hours on a clock, but as something the land actively uses against investigators. Brandon disappeared in May. That matters because in farm country, May is not an empty neutral month. It is a month of growth and work and changing visibility. Fields that are open 1 week can become harder to search. The next ground that is soft can preserve little roadside. Vegetation thickens. Water movement changes with rain and runoff. The search, therefore, was never happening on a frozen stage. The stage itself kept changing while people were trying to understand the first act. This helps explain why later searches mattered so much. When crops came down and visibility improved, teams could revisit spaces that were previously difficult to examine well. When snow melted, new areas became accessible. When water levels shifted, assumptions about drift and concealment had to be reconsidered. Some people hear that and think it makes the case less mysterious, because maybe the environment simply swallowed the evidence before the best search window arrived. Perhaps, but there is another side to that argument. Changing conditions can also reveal what was once hidden. Bodies surface, objects shift, bones appear after erosion, clothing catches on vegetation. Hunters, farmers, and workers notice things when seasons turn, and yet Brandon still was not found. That is what keeps the case suspended between explanation and disbelief. Time should have helped by now, even if it hurt at first. Instead, time mainly deepened the absence. Anniversaries passed. Search plans, adapted interest returned. The land remained unwilling to answer. This is one reason Brandon's disappearance feels different from cases that simply go cold, because no one looks anymore. People did look. They kept looking. They changed methods. They changed seasons. They changed expectations. The case did not die from neglect. It stayed unresolved in spite of care. That distinction matters because it preserves the full weight of the mystery. Not a forgotten boy who slipped through a careless system and vanished, but a young man whose route through the dark was pursued with persistence and still could not be recovered from the world that took him. Sometimes the most revealing way to look at Brandon Case is to imagine the alternative history that almost happened. He leaves the party a little earlier. He takes the highway. All the way home, he misses the ditch by a few feet. He calls his parents and stays in the car until dawn. He guesses his location correctly. His father turns down the right road. Their headlights finally meet in the dark, any one of them. Those changes likely erases the mystery forever. That is what makes this case feel so unnerving. It was not built from a long chain of dramatic choices. It was built from a handful of tiny, ordinary variations that compounded into catastrophe, a wrong turn, a mistaken landmark, a decision to walk a sudden obstacle. That fragility is harder to process than stories with obvious danger because it offers no comfortable distance. You do not get to say that Brandon was reckless in some extreme, unforgettable way. At most he was young, tired, slightly impaired. Perhaps, and too confident in a landscape he thought he understood. Those are human errors, not cinematic ones, and because they are human, the case functions as a kind of mirror. Many viewers can see their own late-night drives in it, their own reliance on horizon lights, their own assumption that if something goes wrong, they can just call someone and keep talking. Until it is fixed, Brandon's story does not let us keep that illusion intact. It reminds us that help can be on the way and still not arrive in time. That a parent can be searching with perfect love and still be trapped by wrong information. That modern communication can preserve the sound of a person without preserving their location. In the end, this may be why the case remains so emotionally sharp. It is not only about what happened to Brandon, it is about the unbearable narrowness of the margin by which he disappeared. The mystery lives in that margin, between the road he meant to take and the road he took, between the town he as sin thought he saw and the place where he really stood, between the final sentence he was speaking and the two words that replaced it, between a rescue that should have happened and the silence that did.